기자부대, hop on the beat!
Welcome back to another episode of Debunking Araki Forgot Extras, where I respond to JoJo fan questions that I didn't already cover. The last video turned out to be a huge one, coming in at 43 minutes. I'm going to dial it back a little bit this time, but I still think I managed to put together a good list of topics. So without wasting any more time, let's get to the first question. The first question deals with part 2. This person asks how Stroheim was able to return to tell the others about what happened to Joseph when he was stranded out in the middle of nowhere as just a torso. Now I could argue that Stroheim as a cyborg could have some kind of tracker implanted in him. However, there's a very clear explanation already, which is the fact that Joseph told Speedwagon over the radio which island he was flying to, so everyone would already know where to look to rescue him. The next one deals with Dio's imprisonment in the coffin for 100 years, spanning from the end of part 1 to shortly before part 3. This person asks why Dio didn't stop thinking like Cars, since as we know, Cars was eventually driven insane from isolation after being stranded in space. Something very important that we need to remember here is that it was never specified exactly how long Cars was in space before he stopped thinking. According to the narration, he wandered for eternity, so it could have been hundreds or thousands of years before this happened. Since we don't actually have a set time for how long it would take to stop thinking, we can't exactly apply it to Dio here. I'd also personally argue that Dio has a stronger will than Cars does as the ultimate embodiment of evil in the series. This person also asks how he was able to survive without oxygen, but of course, as a vampire, this wouldn't be an issue for Dio at all. This next one is about the poker game between Jotaro and Darby in part 3. There, Jotaro was able to bet the souls of Holly and Kakyoin despite them not being there. This person asks why Jotaro couldn't have bet Dio's soul in the game. This is a surprisingly common question you'll find people asking online, despite it being sort of ridiculous. Dio's soul isn't Jotaro's to bet. It was directly stated by Jotaro that because he was on a journey to save his mother, she wouldn't hesitate to let him have her soul. The same is true for all of his allies. Dio is obviously Jotaro's enemy and wouldn't be accepted as a bet. This next question is one I've seen asked quite a few times. They mention the scene when the group first arrives in Egypt where it's said that the Speedwagon agent spotted 9 hooded figures leaving Dio's mansion. However, despite this being the case, they didn't know where Dio's mansion was and had to search all over the city for it later. However, this is not actually the same location. When the group first arrived in Cairo and began looking for the mansion, it was actually said in both the anime and the manga that Dio had relocated his hideout, meaning the place in their spirit photograph is actually a completely different building from the one the agent saw before. Both versions also depict these as different looking buildings. This next one mentions when Rohan used Heaven's Door to make Josuke fly backwards at high speed. They said that despite this being useful, it was never used again. However, this is incorrect. Rohan has used this ability more than once, and the time being mentioned by the comment isn't even the first time it happened. He originally used this on Koichi to save him from the Ghost Alley. After this point, you also need to remember that Rohan doesn't actually get into a lot of fights in part 4, and his preferred method of defense with his ability is usually to prevent people from attacking him, like he did when he was first introduced. His next major appearance was his fight with Ken, when he was unable to use Heaven's Door at all due to 1/3 of his ability being stolen. Next was the dice game, which wasn't really a fight, so he wouldn't have used this power anyway. Then we have Highway Star, where he did use it on Josuke, and then Cheap Trick, where he couldn't actually use his ability on the stand due to it being part of him. Finally, in the Bites the Dust arc, Rohan was temporarily killed by Killer Queen, and using that ability wouldn't have done anything to stop that either way. In case you're wondering, the Thus Spoke Kushibe Rohan stories also don't really feature situations where this power would have been needed. This next one is a common question I got after discussing the time loop near the end of part 4. Back then, people asked how it was possible that Hayato's book had future events written inside of it when this was the first loop. There I explained that this was actually the second loop, not the first. In the first unseen loop, Rohan discovered Kira's identity from Hayato and was killed by Bites the Dust. Then in the second loop, which is the first one we see, when Rohan read Hayato, he saw future events in the book that weren't there before, causing him to learn Kira's identity earlier than he normally would have, and he dies again. Then in the third loop, Rohan was left alone and died automatically. As for how Hayato didn't remember the first loop, I explained that he wrote it off as a dream. These comments don't seem to buy that explanation, since seeing events like the teapot breaking would have made him remember regardless. However, as I'm sure everyone watching this video has experienced, you can end up forgetting your dreams almost instantly after waking up. Even if you're trying to remember or if something happens again, you can still end up forgetting, since often your brain will actively prevent it from being stored. I'd argue that it makes sense that Hayato wouldn't remember the previous loops until at least his second time around. Something I neglected to mention in the video was that the manga itself directly alludes to there being 4 loops rather than 3. Kira says that Hayato must have lived through that morning 4 times before coming up with his plan. The next question deals with the time period that the Thus Spoke Ushibe Rohan chapters are set in. In recent videos, I've mentioned the fact that the newest chapters of the series are set in the 2020s, years after the conclusion of Part 6. However, I've gotten a lot of comments pointing out that the series actually takes place around Part 5, due to Koichi learning Italian from Rohan in one of the chapters. However, there's a bit of a misunderstanding here that I'd like to clear up. The scene being mentioned comes from the anime adaptation of At a Confessional, the first Rohan chapter. Here, Koichi mentions his upcoming trip to Italy in Part 5, placing this around the year 2000. However, this scene only exists in the anime and is not present in the manga. That isn't too important though, since the manga itself for At a Confessional still places it in that time period. Rohan says that his trip to Italy came during his hiatus, which began after he was defeated by Josuke in Part 4. However, this does not mean that the entire series takes place here. In the second and third chapters, Mutsukabe Hill and Millionaire Village, which are said to take place pretty close to each other, Rohan's age is listed as 27, which would place the story around 2007. We do need to remember though that when it comes to ages and times, JoJo isn't exactly consistent, which I've made a video on before. In that third chapter, Izumi mentions an event in 1989 taking place 23 years ago. That places the chapter in 2012, and since that's a more specific figure that actually lines up with the year the chapter was released, I think this is the actual date where it takes place. Regardless, both of these explicitly place the chapters years after Part 5 had already happened. The presence of more modern technology also places these chapters sometime in the future. Subsequent chapters don't really mention their time period. They could be days or years apart from each other. Although I think it's most likely that they take place around the time they released, which is true for most of the other chapters. The chapter Hot Summer Martha is directly stated to be in 2021 and leads into 2022, following the COVID-19 pandemic. The next chapter, Drip Painting Style, is also set after this one. So the only one actually set before Part 5 is that original chapter, with the others happening at least a decade later. This question asks why in Part 5 the gang didn't just use Moody Blues to find the boss's face in the church, where they knew he had been, instead of traveling to Sardinia like they did. I thought it was made pretty clear that their first priority was to escape from the city since they were surrounded by agents of the boss. Pursuing sensitive information directly related to the boss's past was also relevant, since it forced Diavolo to go after them on his own. This next one asks how it's possible that Risotto figured out that Doppio was a stand user. He realized this when Doppio reacted to Aerosmith's sound, which would only be possible if he could see and hear stands. This person points out though that later, Risotto uses Metallica to control Aerosmith since it's made out of iron. If it's made out of a real material, then it would actually be a bound stand that could be seen and heard by everyone. However, this is not what happened. The way that Metallica stuck onto and manipulated Aerosmith isn't because of the stand being made of iron, but because, as we can see, some of Risotto's blood and flesh made it onto the stand. With this, he used his own iron to manifest his stand and turn Aerosmith towards them. The next question deals with the JoJo light novel Purple Haze Feedback, which is focused on Fugo from Part 5. Near the end of the story, Fugo does an attack where he bites into one of his virus capsules. They ask how it's possible that he survived this when Fugo isn't immune to his own virus. This person just seems to know about this attack existing, probably from its appearance in the fighting game All-Star Battle, without actually reading the book since it's explained there very clearly. There, Fugo had Purple Haze attack in another direction as a fake-out so that Volpe would approach him thinking he was safe. Fugo had placed the capsules in his mouth and then bit them to spray the virus into Volpe's face, killing him. This was done with the evolved version of his stand, Purple Haze Distortion. This has a more lethal virus, but the virus is actually able to attack other cells of the same virus. It was explained that Fugo was protected since the virus ate itself before attacking him. However, this didn't actually leave Fugo completely unscathed, since before the virus died out, it badly damaged his mouth and lungs, putting him in the hospital for weeks. It wasn't until some time later that he was completely healed by Giorno. The next question comes from part 6. They ask how Dio knew that those specific 14 phrases were the ones that had to be used in his heaven plan. This is similar to one I already answered in a previous video on why the coordinates were necessary for the plan. However, in this case, it's actually kind of the opposite answer. The actual phrases themselves don't really matter here. Their purpose is to serve as a kind of password, so that the green baby will definitely know to trust the person who says them. And more so than the words themselves, it's actually the action of carving the words that is the most significant. By physically altering his stand, which is also the embodiment of his spirit, Dio had an influence over what stand it will be transformed into through the green baby. So since Dio had carved those words into his soul, the green baby subconsciously knew those words. And more importantly, the act of carving them was also his way of physically inscribing his will to attain heaven onto his stand. And so that will lived on through the green baby to create the stand power necessary for the plan. The next comment asks about a moment from the end of the fight with Jailhouse Lock. Here, Mew Mew fires at Jolene more than 3 times. Since Jolene can only remember 3 things at once, Jolene will forget the first bullet and she won't be able to see it. This person asks how it's possible that Jolene was able to see all the bullets using the reflection since there are still multiple bullets to remember. The thing that's important here isn't so much the number of bullets, but the sequence these events take place in. Mew Mew's bullets aren't all fired at once, they happen in an order. Each shot becomes a new memory because it's a new event taking place, overriding a previous bullet. However, the reflection shows all the bullets at once no matter how many have been shot, which is a single event which isn't overwritten by the appearance of a new bullet, which is why Jolene is able to remember it. This next question asks why when Weather got his memories back, the properties of his stand completely changed. They say that after getting back the disc, he could suddenly no longer change the weather and instead makes people mutate. This is pretty wrong on multiple levels. As I'm sure most people remember, Weather absolutely maintained his normal control over weather after getting back his memories. We see him using lightning, detecting changes in the air, altering air pressure as an attack, and freezing the blood. Now for the main snail mutation ability of Heavy Weather, this is also directly explained in the story to be as a result of changes to the weather, as I've gone over before in my Part 6 video. But just to clarify it here a bit more, Heavy Weather alters the Earth's ozone layer, which is a weather-related ability. By changing the ozone layer, the rays of the sun now carry a subliminal message, which causes those who see them to believe that they are turning into snails so much that they actually begin to turn into them. There's still many people who doubt this ability making any sense, but the manga actually goes into great detail to explain these changes. As Pucci says, subliminal effects can actually cause biological changes. The examples he gives are people being shown subliminal images of food and drinks, causing them to actually crave those things. He also mentions people aging faster from just willing themselves to do so, and stress being able to cause stomach ulcers to appear in people. Like any JoJo ability, this basic concept is taken to its extreme, with a more powerful subliminal effect causing a more drastic change. I've always looked at the Heavy Weather ability as a kind of cosmic horror, with the rays of the sun carrying power that we aren't aware of, which we are just barely protected from by our atmosphere. Next, this comment asks how Emporio hid the weather stand disc when he crossed between universes since his clothes and other non-organic material were destroyed. In case anyone missed it in the last video, I went over how the disc itself actually would make the crossing since they were shown to be indestructible. As for where Emporio hid it, this is actually very simple. As we saw before, that Emporio can store shrunken down ghost objects inside of his belly button, and also inside of a shrunken down ghost bag. This is exactly how he was able to hide Jotaro's disc earlier on, so the same would be true in this case. This one asks why Emporio didn't just hide in his ghost room, since nobody can enter without his permission, meaning Pucci wouldn't be able to reach him. This question is just really strange since the scene being discussed here was actually all about Emporio going to the ghost room, and that was the location of his final encounter with Pucci, so I just don't get how it's possible to miss this. However, there's another misunderstanding here when it comes to Emporio's room. It was never stated that someone needed permission to enter it. The fact that Pucci himself went into the room is proof enough, but we also have the other example of Mew Mew entering it during the Jailhouse Lock arc. Anybody can enter the ghost room as long as they realize that it's there. This question asks how it's possible that Emporio had 2 stand discs inserted at the same time. I assume this person is referring to Weather Report, which he got from the disc, and his original stand burning down the house. However, burning down the house does not come from a disc, and this was never even implied to be the case. The only stand disc Emporio ever inserted was Weather Report's. I'm guessing this person is mainly confused about Emporio seemingly using 2 stands at once. However, as I've gone over before, this is not an issue whatsoever. First of all, even if Weather Report were to replace his original stand, this would not make the ghost room disappear as people seem to think. The ghost room already exists independent of his ability. His stand is just used to draw the ghosts out. As we saw in Dead Man's Questions and even back in Part 4, ghost locations and objects exist totally separate from this. However, the more important thing here is that nothing ever suggested that it wasn't possible to use a second stand from a disc. In fact, it happens multiple times. Back when they first got the Star Platinum disc, Jolene inserted it and even briefly used the stand before it was ejected. And later, Pucci inserted a stand that caused water to boil into FF, which didn't affect her current ability at all. So Emporio would absolutely be able to use Weather Report from a disc, although probably only temporarily. Next is yes, another Emporio question. This one is confused about how fate works in the second universe. Since this was the universe where heaven was in effect and everyone knew their own future and couldn't be changed, how did Emporio manage to trick Pucci into changing it? If him deciding to trick Pucci by holding up the disc is going against his own fate? Well, this is a bit of a misunderstanding since the fate being talked about here is more about the big picture. If you remember back in the Bites the Dust arc, certain things always continued to happen since they were fated, despite minor changes taking place, like the deaths of the characters and the breaking of the teapot. That same principle is true here. It was said in Part 6 that in the new universe, small changes are possible, but the main course of fate will always be the same. So Emporio is able to make smaller changes as long as they don't go directly against fate. So for example, his thoughts aren't fated. He's able to perceive what is happening and he has prior knowledge he otherwise wouldn't, which is of course the whole point of heaven in the first place. We also saw Emporio try to go directly against fate by running away from the ghost room. Since Emporio's fate is to run to the ghost room, this isn't allowed, so fate caused him to fall backwards towards the room anyway. Holding up the disc though is a different story. Emporio inserting the disc on his own would go against fate, since that would be a huge change to the course of events. However, just holding up the disc doesn't actually do anything. The real key to solving this problem is Pucci. Remember that in this world, Pucci is the only one exempt from fate, since he's controlling the shape of the world with Made in Heaven. Pucci can move freely and his actions actually change fate. If you think about it like that, since he's existing in a world where everyone else's fate is rigid, as far as fate is concerned, he doesn't really exist. So Emporio holding up the disc doesn't count as a major change to fate. Since the disc isn't fated to be inserted, holding it up doesn't change anything. It's only when something completely out of fate interferes that a change actually happens. And once one change has been made, the course of fate can change completely, leading to Pucci's defeat. In the previous video, I discussed the new universe from the ending of Part 6. Here, the main cast souls were restored into new lives after being rewarded by fate. I argued that these would be the only major changes to this new universe and that the events of Parts 1 to 5 would be largely unchanged in this new continuity. Other characters like Rohan would also stay the same as we see in the newer chapters. However, this person points out that the sign we see in the new universe says Orland instead of Orlando, showing that there actually are large changes at work. However, this is not what's happened here. This is simply some wonky spelling as a result of this being a Japanese manga. We can find countless examples throughout the series of English words or names being spelled incorrectly, either in the manga itself or on merchandise. We can find things like Joseph's name being spelled wrong, a name like Bruno becoming Blono, and one that is coincidentally very similar to this one. In some places you can find people writing Dio Brando's name as Dio Brand. If you were to say the English word brand in Japanese, it would be pronounced like Brando. So to someone speaking Japanese, the O is kind of redundant when you write it out in English. There's also a bit more evidence against this sign being changed in the New World specifically. The sign normally only appears at the end of the manga, but in the anime adaptation it makes another appearance earlier in episode 25, the start of the third batch. Here the sign is exactly the same as it was at the end. This next person mentions how Steven Steele said that any kind of machine can be used in the Steel Ball Run race, including an automobile, but despite this nobody ended up using one. However, this is incorrect. In the scene where Steven says this, it's actually responding to a reporter saying that a man named Baron Rakachugo entered with an automobile. Steven said that he allowed the use of a car to prove that the age of horses wasn't over. We actually saw the Baron in the 7th chapter when he's passed by Poco Loco. The car broke down in the first stage, and he realized that crossing the continent would be impossible at 400 miles per liter, so he dropped out of the race. This next person asks why Johnny seemed completely unable to use his fingernail bullets in the fight with Pork Pie Hat Kid and was only seen using his toenails. Well, let's take a look at the fight and see if this is true. Early on, we clearly see Johnny spinning his nails, which he comments on. He spins them again after his hand is attacked by the stand. After being hooked, he directly uses his nail bullets to try and cut the wire. Then he's seen shooting them into the ground to cover himself with a dirt cloud. He uses them to roll along the ground and to try and hold on to the rock. Then he uses his toenail bullets for the first time to shoot upwards at the enemy. Then he tries to shoot again but is blocked by the fire around him. He uses them to carve a decoy out of wood, and then shoots the user through the feather. Finally, he shoots the user with both the fingers and toes at the same time. So not only did Johnny still have access to his fingernail bullets here, he used them about 10 times throughout the fight. So I have no clue where this idea would come from. Next is one about Part 8, JoJolion, and the fight with poor Tom and his stand, Ozone Baby. This person asks why they don't just leave the door open to negate the effects of the stand. Well, the way Ozone Baby works is that when you're inside an enclosed space, you'll feel the effects of pressure, which is why we see the bottles crushed. However, once you open up that area, you'll undergo a violent depressurization, which is when the bottles return to normal. Whether you're inside or outside, you're still going to feel the effects of the stand. Jobin said that at first, the pressure was fairly minor, but this also starts building up to dangerous levels. However, the idea that they could just leave the door open here doesn't make any sense. While it's true that without a sealed area, the pressure won't start to build, the characters couldn't possibly know this until it actually starts happening to them. So since avoiding the ability altogether is not an option, they either have to withstand the sudden depressurization, or hold out while the inside pressure slowly starts to hurt them. This is why Jobin and Tsurugi opted to stay inside, since if they opened the door again, they would instantly die. And for Josuke, he was able to use his bubble to still go outside while maintaining a safer pressure. This person asks why Wonder of You appeared at the funeral of Mamazuku's father, and also why he killed the father in the first place. Well, the reason the father died was directly stated. He was caught up in the flow of calamity. Wonder of You mentions that the orchard was very valuable land, which they didn't deserve to have. So by attacking the fruit with the rock insect, he lured Mamazuku's father out to be killed by a landslide from calamity. Later, Mamazuku's mother died of illness, which Ikafu says was also due to his family being affected by calamity. The reason he would want that kind of land would of course be for his secret cultivation of the Rokakaka. As for why Ikefu would attend the funeral, the stand's persona at the time was likely affiliated with Mamazuku's father in some way, in order to take control of the orchard and submerge them in negative flow. Remember, this is before the actual name Ikefu and the identity of the doctor were taken, which happened a few years later. So the identity that Toru and his stand would be using at the time would probably be whatever matches up with cultivating the fruit, rather than researching its effects using the hospital, which wouldn't come till sometime later. And that's every Araki Forgot topic for now. If there's a topic you'd like to see me cover in the next video, go ahead and comment it down below or leave it as a reply to the pinned comment. I ask that if you do use the pinned comment though, please don't reply to a bunch of people in it since there's actually a limit on how many replies will fit. If you want to be updated on new videos, I hope that you'll subscribe and click the bell. You can also join the Hum and Beat Discord to be updated on new video releases and any important JoJo news. Finally, I'd appreciate if you help support the channel on Patreon. There you'll receive some Discord perks and the opportunity to submit questions. This video's question comes from Adam Grogan. He asks, how many times have I read each part of JoJo? Well, of course, I did one read through each for the first time. After that, though, I haven't really had a formal sit down to read parts in their entirety. An exception would be Part 8, which I've done some rereads of while it was still ongoing. I did re-experience the stories through the anime adaptations, and in the case of Parts 1, 2, and 3, I've rewatched the anime multiple times over. But regardless, I say if you added everything up, I've read each part many times. Since for videos, I'll very often go back to a certain chapter or two to confirm something. Sometimes when I do this, I'll also get caught up in reading it and maybe finish a small arc within the part. Some videos also require skimming through an entire part to see what references are made or stuff like that. Those are the closest I've gotten to a full read-through, and doing this process so many times is what helps me remember what happens when very well. I generally have a very good idea for where to check if I want to confirm something. If you want to submit a question, you can join the Patreon at any tier and submit them via my page's Member Posts tab. There's no limit to how many questions you can ask, so I hope that you'll post as many as you'd like. Thank you for watching. This is the part of the video where I thank my $5 and up patrons. Thank you to Alex Ramirez, Doorbell, Crayon, Rigovids, Zucato, Pumpkin Doge, Marrow, Almighty Quarth, Gatling Grove, Lime Jinjo, Sponge Cake, Cakext, Feliciano Rabaja, Rayana Meme, Christian McDonough, Navi, Emmanuel Etienne, Pulse Dog, Great Riek, Carmo Trina, Hunter Gill, Adam Grogan, Zach Greenfield, FIFO, Rob Goliath, Jacob Smith, Professor Foosball, Ryan Ramirez, and Big T.